So this is just an image of a stage looking from the back of the stage out towards the audience. What I love about this image is that you see all the things that the people in the audience don't see. You see all the lighting rigs and the various boxes and equipment. And so what I want to talk about today is how to bring all of these kind of unseen aspects when you're teaching drama, try to bring it to life for your students. And I want to start with this particular image. This is one of my favorite images. I use it all the time in my teaching. I used it on a poster for a conference once because I think this kind of gets at what it is to teach drama. We've got the spotlight here, but all that we really see is the book. And of course, that's not what theater really is. Drama, when we teach drama in an English classroom, it's really, I think, the only time we teach a form of literature that is ultimately unfinished, right? If you're teaching a poem, that poem is finished. The poem is on the page. If you're teaching a novel or a short story, it's finished. It's written there on the page. That is what it is. But if you're teaching a play, it's not really finished. You're teaching a blueprint for something that is really supposed to live in the theater. Really, instead of teaching this, what we're trying to convey is something like this. And I use Hamilton here because I'm assuming almost everyone loves Hamilton. And I'm not actually going to be talking about Hamilton. I'm sorry for any of you big Hamilton fans out there. But I want to use this as an example to convey the idea that imagine you were trying to teach the musical Hamilton, but all you had was the written text, not even the music, right? Not even the cast album. All you had was the literal script and the lyrics to all the rapping going on. That would be very difficult to convey what actually happens in something like the musical Hamilton. But that's really what we have to try to do whenever we're teaching drama. We have to try to convey some sense of how this actually lives in 3 dimensions with actual people behind it, because that's what drama is, right? The phenomenon of publishing drama as a book is relatively new. Even Shakespeare never published a single play within his lifetime. So various plays were published illegally within his lifetime, but he was never behind the publication of any of his plays in his lifetime. The most authoritative edition of his plays, the first folio, was published, I think, about 7 or 8 years after his death as a kind of commemorative edition. So the idea of publishing drama is really a kind of 19th century invention. And even then, plays really they live on the stage, and we have to try to find a way to convey that to our students. So to do that today, to give you a sense of how to start, I'm going to turn to someone incredibly old, namely the Greek philosopher Aristotle. Now, he's got sunglasses on here so that he's still cool. Right? Yes, I get it. I get that this is ridiculous. It's easier to convey this in person when I'm in front of you, but the idea here is that I want to show how Aristotle's tools for analyzing drama can actually still be relevant even today in the 21st century, even though they were written down in the 4th century BCE, a good, approximately 2,400 years ago. I think Aristotle knew his stuff, and he can still be very useful to us. But one thing we do need to keep in mind if we're going to turn to Aristotle as a way to kind of help our students understand drama is that Aristotle never did this, right? You can do the where's Waldo. It's pretty easy in this case. And find Aristotle right there. He's got a front row seat because he's a famous Greek philosopher. But in fact, Aristotle didn't do this. When he was writing about drama, he actually lived about 100 years after the most famous Greek plays were performed. When Aristotle was writing about drama, he was actually doing this. He was actually in a library where he was reading these plays as they had been written down. And so I think Aristotle is particularly useful because he's coming at drama as a written text. But I think that there are ways that we can use him in order to help bring the actual performance alive and not just have it be a library-style literary exercise. Okay, with that in mind, these are the 6 elements of drama, according to Aristotle, and these are the 6 elements that I'm going to be talking about. And there's a little bit of papyrus on the right with some ancient Greek writing on it. It's not actually Aristotle's Poetics, but gives you the idea. And so I want to talk about action, character, thought, diction, music. I'm going to talk only briefly about, and spectacle. And I'll explain what each of these terms are as we go. But these are different ways of approaching a play and thinking about a play to help you bring it alive for your students. And then in the workshop portion afterwards, we'll walk through an actual play and try to put some of this into action. Now, these are actually ranked according to Aristotle. This is the rank that he thought that they belonged in, that action was first and spectacle was last. I happen to disagree with some of that ranking, as many of us would disagree with any ranking, any kind of BuzzFeed list, right? This is the ancient Greek version of that. And I'll talk about some areas where I think Aristotle does get it wrong in terms of the ranking, particularly with that last one, spectacle, which I think should really be near the top. It's not such a bad thing. But first, I want to talk about action. So this is what Aristotle says is the most important part of any play. And you might say, wait a second, shouldn't that be character? Like, if we don't have any actors, we don't really have a play, right? But Aristotle says, no, actually, it matters more what they're doing than who they are, first and foremost. And we can debate whether that's true or not, but this is Aristotle's perspective. But here I want to play a little game called Story, Not Story. And it'll be explained more on the next slide. So on one side, we have a story, and on the other, we have not story. And the question is kind of what word do you need to connect these events that are described here, these abstract events, this happened, this happened, this happened, to make this a story or not a story. And if any of you have done your narrative theory at some point, you have to have done that, but if you've done it, then you'll know that the words need to be something like this, right? For it to be a story, it should be something like so or because, although it's hard to start with because, right? So I use so there. And for it to be a not story, then it's then, right? So this happened, then this happened, then this happened. That's not a story. I woke up, I brushed my teeth, I ate breakfast. You know, that's a list of things that happened with some kind of temporal connection, that they're happening maybe chronologically. That's not really a story. A story is about an event that happens that then triggers another event, that then triggers another event, and there's a causal connection between them that gives us the events of the total narrative. It's not just a kind of random collection of things that have happened. It's a particular collection of events that lead one from the other to the other to the other. And that's how we get a story as opposed to just a recounting of random events. Now, in most forms of literature, I'm really, I guess, just talking about fiction here, I guess you could throw in epic poetry, right, which is also narrative. But in most narrative forms of literature, you actually have a narrator who explains this to you. Now, you might not know that you have a narrator. Here is Stephen Fry, one of my favorite actors, who's actually narrating a play. So I thought this was appropriate. He looks like a narrator, very well dressed here. But because any work of fiction always has a narrative voice, even if it's third person omniscient, right? There's still the idea of a voice that is connecting these events for you, that is deciding which events happen and giving you kind of clues to why they might be connected or how someone might feel, and that causes their action in a certain way, right? The narrator is giving you clues. Even actually, if you're watching a movie, you almost always have a narrator. And I'm not talking about a voiceover. I'm talking actually about the camera itself serves as a kind of narrator for you, because the camera, whether you like it or not, the camera, the invisible, the camera that's filming the movie tells you where to look, right? Over here, there's the car chase. Now over here, here's the close-up of the hero. He's upset. Over here, there's the villain, right? It's telling you where to go, and it's building those connections for you. Drama is actually really unique among narrative literary forms because we don't have a narrator. Now you might say, all right, well, I went to, my kid's elementary school play and they had a narrator. Fine, yes, that's correct. But that's not the kind of drama we're teaching in the high school or college classrooms. Most plays do not have an actual literal narrator. There are a few famous exceptions. If anyone's going to scream out, Thornton Wilder's Our Town. You're like, okay, fine. Yes, he has a narrator. Most plays do not actually have a narrator, someone who's telling you this happened, so this happened, so this happened. And yet, that's essential to conveying action, to conveying the story of a play, right? So how does that happen? Well, that happens because everyone on the stage, right? This is a picture from Rent, showing my age here. Back in the 90s, it was the Hamilton of its moment back in the 90s. but everyone on this stage has to work together to tell you that story. And they don't do it explicitly. They don't usually come forward and tell you, now this happened, then this happened, then this happened. They do it by treating the script in a very particular way. And so this is getting at the first major technique that I want to talk about and that I'll do more of in the workshop. And this is called determining the beat structure, or figuring out the beats of a play, B-E-A-T, like the beats on a drum. This is an actual script from an actual actor, nobody famous at all, it just happened to be on the internet when I was looking for examples of this. But this is a script to the Neil Simon play Rumors. This is not really a classic work of drama. This is just the kind of play you might do in summer stock or in a community theater, or if you were, in New York in the 1960s, maybe you saw it on Broadway, but that was a long time ago. It's, just a pretty straightforward comedy. And yet you have to treat it in the same way you would treat Hamlet when you're trying to figure out how to present it as a play. There are two things going on the screen here. I'm only going to talk about one of them right now, and then I'm going to come back and talk about the other one a little bit later in the presentation. Right now, I just want to talk about, you can't see my finger, sorry. Maybe you can see my cursor here. I just want to talk about the lines. I'm going to be drawing a bunch of these lines on a script when we go into the workshop. And each of these lines, the space between these lines, each of these little kind of blocks that are being created by these lines is supposed to represent a beat in the story, meaning that on these two pages, there is a progression between here, what's going on in that first line, and what's going on here in the last line. Something is changing over the course of this little bit of text. Technically, what's going on here is that the mayor of the city has fainted or gotten sick, and the advisor is trying to get, Chris is actually a woman here, trying to get his wife not to tell anyone, to call the doctor but not let anyone know. And then at the end, she finally has a revelation that he's trying to cover something up. And each of these beats is covering a slightly different part of that progression, right? There's the first kind of building block, and then the relationship actually changes a little bit, and then it changes a little bit again, and again, and again, and then finally we get to this different relationship at the end. There's no narrator to tell us this. The actors sit there, and with the director usually, sometimes on their own, they come up, they draw these lines, and they figure out the beat structure, and they figure out that progression of actions. This happens, so this happens, so this happens, so this happens, even though it's all just dialogue. They figure that out so they can figure out where they're going in this story. And I'm going to do some of this work kind of walking you through it in the workshop. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Don't worry, I'll come back to it. But that gets you the action. And when you look at a script, it's not just a wall of text. You have to actually try to figure out this happens, so this happens, so this happens. And this is great for students to figure out, to see how the text is actually building a story, how it's building that action. Okay, so this gets us to character. Of course, here we have some actor somewhere playing Hamlet. We know because he's got the skull of Yorick up there, the kind of classic Hamlet pose. And so what is character? We might say character is personality, it's background, it's where you come from, it's who your family is, and all these things are true. And if you're an actor, you have to think about all of these things. But the way that Aristotle thinks about this, and the way that I think is useful for us to think about it in the classroom, is that character, meaning an actor on stage, a character in a play, is actually really the same thing as character, meaning the moral quality of a person. Those two words, it's not just a synonym in English. It's actually, Aristotle is getting at the similarity between those two words, and that the action of the play reveals to us the character, as in the moral character of the personages involved in the play. This is very important because this is how you really kind of truly understand how character works in drama. It's not just a random collection of people in a certain place and time. It's also about revealing who those people really are. And the work of most good plays, of a good piece of drama, is to reveal to you the inner character of those people whom you only get to see from the outside. And so I'll talk more about Hamlet in a moment, but in the next section, but there's always some kind of decision that a proper character needs to make. Hamlet very famously has to decide whether or not he's going to avenge his father and murder Claudius, because he doesn't know for sure if Claudius, his uncle, is really guilty of murdering his father. He has to figure that out. That decision process is part of his character. Here we have an actress playing Antigone. Antigone has to make a fateful decision that happens even before the play starts of whether or not she's going to bury her brother Dionysus. Here you see her casting the sand down to bury her brother so he can move into the afterlife. And then the rest of the play is about her decisions in dealing with the outcome of that. Here we have a scene from The Crucible where John Proctor has to decide how he's going to respond to the literal witch hunt that's going on in Salem Village. All of these characters have to make decisions. If a character isn't making big decisions, then the play isn't really working very well as a play. Here we have a scene from A Raisin in the Sun where the Youngers have to decide how they're going to use the inheritance money. The whole play is about deciding what they're going to do with this money and what it's going to mean for them as a family. It's about making huge decisions. And so here we have a little math that you weren't expecting that. I'm not good at math either. Maybe some of you are. Congratulations to you. But this is what's called a decision tree. And I'm not going into the specifics here, mathematically speaking, but just the idea of this, I think, is really useful. That a character at the beginning of the play will be faced with a decision, and he either does this or the other. And then there will be another decision in that process, and she either does this or the other. And then there's another decision. Maybe not every single scene, but each major portion of the play is going to require them to make some kind of big decision. And the way that we trace their character, the way that we understand who they are as a person and what their moral character is by how they're making these decisions. A true piece of drama, the kind that we would teach in a classroom, is going to involve some very emotional, weighty decisions for the main characters. And what we do in a play, when we're watching a play, when we're reading a play, is really what we're doing is tracing the decisions of those characters as they are faced with different conundrums. So Hamlet has to decide whether he's going to go see the ghost of his father or not. He does. He has to decide whether he's going to talk to it or not. He does. He has to decide if he's going to listen to it immediately or not. He does. Right? He doesn't. He decides he's not going to listen to it immediately. He has to decide how he's going to make his decision. He's going to put a play on for his stepfather, Claudius. He does that, and then he makes decisions based on that. And we trace that character through that decision-making process. And through that, we get to know their moral character in addition to just who they are in time and space. And that actually brings us to one of the most kind of enigmatic of Aristotle's terms, but I think one of the most interesting, and that's thought. And so you might say, well, what is thought? We're reading a play. This is not a work of philosophy. Why is thought really, what does thought mean here? So what Aristotle means by thought, at least as it's useful to us in the classroom, is really the overall trajectory of the play, how action meets character, who that main character becomes, and then the question, the thought of how do we become something that seems impossible from the beginning. And almost every really great play will involve some kind of transformation that seems impossible and that will make us think, wow, that's how that happened. So I've got three very famous examples from literature here. On the one hand, we have Oedipus, right? If any of you teach Greek drama, you might teach Oedipus Rex or Oedipus Tyrannos. And Oedipus begins the play as the noble king of Thebes. Everyone loves him. He's a well-loved ruler. And by the end, he's completely humiliated. He's blinded himself. He's decided that he's going to exile himself from the community. And the question is, how does a noble king become a despised exile? And we get there through this kind of decision tree of the decisions that Oedipus makes. Going back to Hamlet for a minute, just because it's a play I'm assuming many of you might be familiar with, we start with a noble prince of Denmark, a student, a very reputable, sensitive, thoughtful young man who by the end becomes a mass murderer. He's killed multiple people in this play, and the play ends in complete bloodshed and terror. And the question is, how does this noble person become this homicidal person? What might cause them to do that? What are the decisions along the way? And we think about what has to happen for that to for that to take place. And then a very different example, but you'll see it's the same basic principle at work. Here it's Henrik Ibsen's famous play A Doll's House from Norway in the 1860s. So a very different time and place. But here we start with Nora Helmer, who is a very respectable middle-class housewife. The almost the perfect example of a quote-unquote respectable middle-class housewife. And by the end of the play, she has decided to divorce her husband and leave her husband and her children and go off and set her own path in the world. It's a complete transformation. And again, it happens by marking this decision tree, by all these decisions, by the meeting of character and action together helps us think about what must take place for these transformations to happen. Now, there is one very famous counterexample here. I'm assuming you're probably not teaching it in high school, but many of you may know it anyway. I'm referring, of course, to Waiting for Godot, the famous play by Samuel Beckett, first performed in 1953. In many ways, this play marks a kind of endpoint for the kind of drama that I'm talking about as being the main or only form of drama that gets performed. Waiting for Godot basically takes everything I just said and completely tosses it on its head. That there's very little action in the play, if any of you know it, right? There's very little causal relationship between the events that happen. The characters, Didi and Gogo, or Vladimir and Estragon, are defined by not really making decisions at all throughout the play. And then there's no transformation. There's nothing for us to think about in terms of them turning into other things by the end of the play. It's the complete opposite of everything I've talked about, and it ushers in a new age of what we might call postmodern drama. I'm not talking about that today, but I do want to make clear that, yes, there are actually other forms of drama, and Waiting for Godot is in many ways a kind of beginning of that, but primarily I'm talking today about more traditional forms of drama. Okay, that gets us to diction. Now, by diction, Aristotle means one thing, but we're going to expand it a little bit. So diction, he does mean like the poetry. And in his time, as in Shakespeare's time, plays were written in verse. And so it's a question of, how poetical is the language? How good is the rhyme scheme and the meter and all of that? And so here we have a picture of a first folio edition of Hamlet. And so you might think, okay, well, that's just about studying the poetry. But of course, not all plays are written in verse. Diction really means something else. It really means, how does the language convey to us everything that I've just been talking about? Because the only tool that a playwright has is language. It's just what's written down on the page. Actors have a whole different set of tools. Directors have a whole different set of tools. But the playwright only has their language. Now, even if that playwright is not Shakespeare, and most playwrights are not Shakespeare by definition, language still has to work in a very particular way from them. It needs to work like an iceberg. And so here we have just a kind of internet picture of an iceberg. And when you look at an iceberg, on the top, right, there's what you see. And then underneath, there's the rest of the iceberg, which is usually a lot bigger than what you actually see. And so what you're reading in a script is just the top of that iceberg. And there's a ton that's underneath those lines. And it's the job of the actor to be able to convey to you all of that things that are underneath without actually saying them. And you want your students to start to approach the text of a drama like an actor, to start thinking about what is underneath the language. Now, on this slide, I'm expecting you all to print this out and memorize it. There's going to be a quiz tomorrow morning at the start of the session. I'm kidding. There's no quiz. This slide is ridiculous. This is taken from a page of an actor training manual by a very famous Russian director named Konstantin Stanislavski, who basically invented the way that actors are trained in the 20th century and into the 21st, something that he called the system, and that in the American version is known as method acting. You don't need to understand everything going on here. I don't understand everything going on here. This slide is a little bit crazy. What matters here is that there's two sides to an actor's performance. On the one hand, on the right-hand side, we have the outer performance, the outer theatrical sense of self, as Stanislavski calls it. And on the other side, you have the inner side. Now, a lot of this is actually happening kind of before modern psychology really takes hold. So Stanislavski is sort of inventing a lot of modern psychology through the process of actor training. The idea here, though, is that what you see on the outside, on the right, is only half of the picture. And everything else is going on the inside, in the inner life of the character. And so what that character actually says in any given moment may or may not actually be the same as what's going on inside. And they may actually have some ulterior motive or some other purpose or some psychological aspect that they are expressing through that language. And it's only half of the story. We only see all of this out here, and we don't see all of this in here. And so now I come back to the same slide to talk about what the other markings on the text. So we talked a little bit about the beat structure, right? The different, so this happened and this happened and this happened, even in just 2 pages of dialogue, right? But then what are all these other markings? Well, this is again a Neil Simon play. This is not William Shakespeare. This is not great diction in the poetic sense. It's just what? Don't tell him. What about Charlie, to say the line of the actress playing Chris, right? And yet, for each one of those lines, this actress has written some kind of verb, this kind of infinitive form of verb: to question, to interrogate, to worry, to consider, to assess, to consider again, to pacify, so we've got to change here, to berate, right? To explain, to amend. These are what she would consider her motivations, right? This is the classic actor thing. What's my motivation, right? If you have a stereotypical line that an actor will say to a director, what's my motivation here, director? This is exactly what we're talking about. This is about the subtext, what is going on underneath the iceberg. So even though she's just saying what, she has to keep in mind as an actress, okay, she's questioning her husband. It's not just asking for information, it's actually questioning him, like, what's going on? What are you getting at? Right? And then it gets more intense. She's not just questioning, she's interrogating him, even though she's just saying, don't tell him, right? And so this is a mark to her as to how she should say the line. It's not just what, don't tell him, right? Which would be a very neutral kind of reading. It would be something more like, what? Don't tell him, right? So you actually are getting some motivation behind there. And through these motivations, we're starting to build a sense of who this character is. And notice, this goes along with the beat structure. She starts with to question, right? Which is, relatively tame as motivations go. It's not even to challenge. We get that a little bit later, right? But just to question. And we end with to defy. So in just 2 pages of a non-brilliant text, right? Just a plain old-fashioned Neil Simon comedy, we move from questioning her husband to defying her husband. And that is the movement of this particular scene. But that doesn't really happen. We don't see that in the language explicitly. It's just what? And then, yes, a little ringing in the ears, where she's actually telling the doctor on the phone what's going on, in defiance of her husband. This is about the series of events and the decisions that happen over this course to reveal her character, that she is someone who in a crisis will defy her husband, even though her husband is trying to control. And that is the revelation of her character. And that is the thought of what happens in this scene. Now, there's 2 other elements, and these for Aristotle are the least important of the 2 elements. One is music, and this one is not going to be so relevant to us. I put it in there because it is one of Aristotle's categories. For most plays that you would teach in a high school classroom, music isn't probably going to be part of it. Aristotle was thinking of Greek tragedy. That's what he was reading in the 4th century BCE. And so he's thinking of the Greek chorus. And so here we have a picture of the Greek chorus, whose lines would actually be sung with music, not in the sense of like a modern musical, more of a kind of like ritualistic chant, but there was actually music in all of these plays. And so that's part of what Aristotle was considering. In fact, this is not anything you guys need to know per se, but it's just an interesting factoid. The invention of opera in Italy in the 1500s came out of an attempt to try to reconstruct the conditions of Greek tragedy as they would have been performed in ancient Greece, to try to perform plays with music. And so they were trying to do Greek tragedy, and they ended up with opera, which is not the same as Greek tragedy, but if you like opera, it's great too. But they were trying to do Greek tragedy. In any case, now today, there is of course still music. We all still love Hamilton, but that's generally not what we do in an English classroom. But there are still, of course, plays with music, where the music is incredibly important. But I want to talk more about the very last category that Aristotle, excuse me, had on his list, and that's spectacle, which is what you actually see on stage. And he uses this word spectacle very deliberately. This is not just him trying to find a word for the stuff you see on stage. He's using spectacle as a kind of derogatory term in the way that we might, you might see it in a movie review today. Oh, it was all spectacle, all just CGI special effects. And so here we have, this is from an actual play called Einstein on the Beach, which has a lot of spectacle in it. It's very interesting to watch. And Aristotle says that's the least important thing, right? Really what matters is everything else I was talking about. The spectacle doesn't really matter. I want to make the case that here Aristotle was actually wrong, and that spectacle matters quite a lot to understanding drama. But spectacle doesn't have to just mean flashy lights and people flying around the stage. It can be something as simple as what I'm showing you here. This is from an actual Broadway production of the play A View from the Bridge by Arthur Miller, directed by who's a very famous director from Holland named Ivo van Hove. It is very, very plain. There's no fancy costumes. The stage is bare. The people are wearing bare feet, and yet it is very visually compelling. What Ivo van Hove is very famous for doing is taking an empty space with very plain character, with very plain costuming, and making it very compelling to look at just by the way he places those bodies in space. I'm actually going to talk more about this in the webinar, in the seminar portion of this when I go over the text. But bodies in space, which I think is the better way to think about this idea of spectacle, is essential for the drama. Drama is about actors in a room performing something, and the way that those actors are positioned in space tells you a lot about their relationships. Just from these two pictures, right? You probably don't know the play, maybe you do. You probably haven't seen this production. I didn't see it, actually, I just read a bunch of reviews about it. But we can already tell a lot about what's going on here. We can tell that these two characters are in conflict, even if he wasn't pointing. Here, we can tell that they're in conflict. We can tell that this character is more on this character's side. We can tell that these two characters are trying to stay out of this. We can tell that these characters are trying to stay in the background away from this confrontation. We don't have a script in front of us. We don't have language in front of us. We can tell this just by the way that bodies are arranged in space. And what's very important when you're teaching drama is to make sure that the students remember that the language that they're reading, this book on the chair, actually represents this, that it actually represents bodies in space communicating that story to you. Now, I'm going to have a few exercises for ways to think about it and ways to try to get your students to live that and to embody that a little bit and keep that in mind. But this is how the story gets told, by the actors in a room having done all of that work that I've talked about, coming up with the beat structure, coming up with their motivations, thinking about their decisions that they're making over the course of the play. All of that working together to convey a story in space, which is what drama really is. It's not just a story on the page, it's a story that happens in space. And that's what we need to try to help our students understand so they can really get the full richness of a dramatic text. Okay, I think I'm just shy of time here. So I will stop there and be very happy to answer questions.